Hi, I'm Jeff Hayes. I have been asked for years to do a docuseries on cancer, and I never would agree to do it. On April 8th, 1969, my dad woke me up and told me that my mom had passed away the previous night. I was 11 years old. It was the defining, most pivotal moment of my life. Later, I had a child who passed away from cancer, and so it wasn't just that it was an emotional issue, it was that this is my work. I don't want to do anything that could in any way be exploitive of something that's a very personal story. But over the last couple of years, I had so many friends become ill that it included a naturopath that I dearly love and ended up having a double mastectomy. My closest friend in the world ended up having stage 4 ovarian cancer. And then really the last straw was one of my cancer experts that when we did medical shows, we would film her, a medical doctor in Chicago, Tony Bark, on May 29th of last year, was diagnosed with stomach and esophageal cancer. And that was the one that I just said, we have to do this. And so the purpose of this is much different than the other docuseries I do. I think we've done a good job as we've gone around the country and tried to gather the experts that can justify the title, The Answer to Cancer. I hope that by the time you finish the series that you think we lived up to the title.
There is no cancer in the history of mankind that was caused by a lack of chemotherapy. And with that simple realization, no matter how good I was going to get at designing a chemotherapeutic approach for my patients, I was never going to stop that cancer from happening. I was never going to change the course of multiple surgeries that fail and then offering a couple of highly toxic drugs at the end of that. Did we spend so much time focusing on disease management that we forgot that there was maybe an opposite and equal to that disease process? Would there be perhaps something called health?
They haven't even taken a blood test yet, and they were forcing chemotherapy, and they reported to the state that he had 2 weeks to live.
Darren and Barbara Jensen charged with kidnapping and medical neglect because they refused chemotherapy for their son.
They did all these things to try to find some cancer, and every one of those tests came out negative.
He said I had invisible cancer and that I had to do chemotherapy anyways.
I like to get people thinking about plant medicine, right? Botanical allies. We can use cannabis because it's a perfect poster child for the entire botanical kingdom in representing how valuable it is in food, fiber, and medicine.
I speak to a number of women who are going through metastatic breast cancer, and I offer advice, but I don't tell anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with. Everyone has to make their own decision on their journey. But I may not be here if it hadn't been for these things.
Welcome to the Answer to Cancer documentary series. At Revealed Films, this is our most ambitious project to date. For my partner and our producer, Jeff Hayes, this was a deeply personal journey, and we put everything we had into it because we know what's at stake. Cancer is quite a subject to try to tackle. There's so much meaning surrounding it. It's not just what's the newest research, what's the most advanced methods of treatment, but there's also real human stories and meaning that attaches to all of this. So we spanned the globe. We spoke to experts from every different discipline. We spoke to patients and what their personal experiences were. And in the end, we put together what I think is the most compelling and comprehensive series ever done on the topic of cancer. We're about to start right now, episode 1. But before we do, I want to encourage you to share this. We have a limited time free viewing period where anybody, anywhere in the world can watch this documentary series. It can change lives. It can save lives. It can have massive impact, but that will only be true if you share it. We all have been touched by cancer. It has been a part of all of our lives, either directly or indirectly. So I encourage you to support us in this mission. Spread the word. Simply share that this documentary series is available right now so other people can learn about the answer to cancer. Episode 1 is coming right up. It is full of important, compelling information, and I can't wait to share this with you right now. When I hear the expression beautiful soul, the first person that pops into my head is Dr. Zach Bush. He's like a brother to me, and I've gotten to know him over the years because of his ideas and what he shares in the world and how he participates in the healing of humanity. He's a triple board certified medical doctor. He's a former cancer researcher, but he's got a context that very few people hold. And it's something I think that brings hope to humanity, something that is a part of this series that I believe is powerful and life-changing. And I want you to really get quiet, turn off all distractions, and listen to this man. It will change your life. Zach, we're about to have a really important conversation, so thanks for taking the time.
Such a blessing to be here. Your audience is as stimulating as you are.
Thanks, man. So when we talk about cancer, this is an area that you have a particular amount of expertise and I think some unique context. So you're a traditionally trained medical doctor, and then it's led you to places, but let's get into your background a little bit. So you went to medical school, you got out of school, and then you decided to go into maybe some areas of specialty or research. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so went through the traditional medical doctorate training at the University of Colorado, coming out of my experience in the Philippines, which kind of changed my career direction from engineering into medicine. And I had been birthing babies there with a group of international midwives. And so my first glimpse into the miracle of human life was that birth canal, bringing forth this life that is so inexplicable every time you see it. And from there, going into that medical model with the highest of intention of being able to relieve suffering and the malnutrition and just the lack of care that I saw in the Philippines. By the end of that 4 years had been turned into a technician, unknowingly. And a lot of the soul, I think, had been ripped out of my worldview of where I was heading.
When you say technician, meaning just follow flow charts and algorithms, that's care?
I had memorized so much stuff, crammed it into my head, and then spent 2 years intensively in the hospitals, rotating through every subspecialty from orthopedic surgery, doing open heart surgery with the cardiovascular surgeons, to the oncology wards, to end-stage liver failure on the GI floors, to renal dialysis centers. Like, you just see the whole works. And what you're trained up to today is really to be a pharmaceutical and kind of medical technology expert. And you're either learning how to manage a diverse team who are bringing a bunch of resources, or you become expert in one of these pathways of pharmacy or medical technology. And in the end, you find yourself in such a deluge of information, technology, and really time crunch that you often, I think, lose the forest for the trees.
So, and you used the term, I think you said the soul got ripped out. So what do you mean by that?
Certainly by the time I was, well into my subspecialty training in internal medicine, I was starting to, face some depression in my life, just really not sure what this medical field was going to bring, how I was going to participate in it. It's actually what drove me towards, continuing to 3 subspecialties, just like looking for that substance within, because in this ever-churning effort to see patients as a list of symptoms followed by a list of laboratories, a list of imaging results, pathology, and then a bunch of drugs and interventions that I need to sort out for a treatment plan. There's no soul within that space. There's just a sense of algorithms, and you're trying to fit things into patterns that have been taught to you, and if they don't fit the patterns, you face denial and justification and rationalization of why they do fit into the pattern, even if they don't. And so in that journey, you start to feel soulless yourself, and I think we find this in any field of practice, whether that's medicine or law or going into service industries, hospitality. When it starts to look like check boxes on a Yahoo reviews, and that's how you're measuring your success, it starts to become a really hollow experience. And in a bizarre way, I think physicians are now facing that same kind of, Yahoo kind of experience of like, am I just being liked and unliked, or am I really, finding myself in this midst? And so in a way, the heady mission of healing human disease can take you far, far from the human part of that.
So it's interesting because it seems like there's really no compassion in it and no creativity in it, right? And so here, you have all these skills and training, obviously uncommon intelligence. I mean, to get through and get the grades necessary to get into medical school and then to complete all that, there's got to be a pretty good amount of intelligence at play.
That could be argued, probably.
But yes, and then suddenly you get there and there's no art or soul in it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think the art is an important descriptor there that I think really rings true. There's no encouragement towards a creative process in getting to know your patient or finding a pathway for the patient. And there's certainly no encouragement to figure out why'd your patient end up here. Why they walk into your office with the list of conditions they have. We were really discouraged from taking a deep look at that. And that's ultimately, once I started doing that, unbeknownst to me, I was quickly about to face a deconstruction moment. You can't go down that rabbit hole of why and keep your pharmaceutical model of health and disease intact.
Interesting. And as you stated, you're I guess you have multiple specialties, which is really kind of unusual because you're board certified as an internist, right? And you said endocrinology. And then the third one, which is interesting, because those two have relationships to each other, right?
Deep.
Internal medicine and endocrinology, but hospice care. So what got you moving in that direction?
The journey into kind of that, why am I here, what am I doing, and wondering if I ever really was going to be able to fulfill that Hippocratic oath that I took saying I was going to do no harm. The experiences in the hospitals that I felt like really fulfilled that oath was the dying moments. When my patients suddenly hit that terminal point where it was clear that there was no more intervention options. It was time for quality of life rather than quantity of life. It was time for dignity, not more intervention. At that moment, we tend to peel off all the layers. We peel away the technologies, we peel away the drugs, and we encourage family to come in, and we get some sort of pastor or spiritual person in there, and we get multi-generational experience around the patient again. Within a few days of that, you start to wonder, why did we wait till the last few seconds of this person's life to create that? And so that was part of that journey in. And then deeper than that, in the ICU setting, when I was resuscitating patients almost every shift in an ICU, somebody's coding, heart stops, you rush in, paddles, looks like something out of the ER movies and everything else, and you're pumping drugs into them, and the heart restarts, and they can be dead anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes is kind of a fast turnaround on a code. Sometimes it's 15, 20 minutes. They turn around and heart starts pumping, and for some of those, they're coming back and talking to you in a few minutes. And when that starts to happen repeatedly, it's not just medicine and its paradigm that starts to fall apart. It was my religious belief system, it was my self-belief system, and all of that started to get severely challenged by these vivid experiences that people were coming back from the other side of whatever it is we call human life. They were having vastly more fascinating experiences on the other side of that. And that really had planted some major seeds in my mind of what should care look like? Where did we sacrifice community for intervention? And then when did we forget to include a bigger picture of life when we considered our treatment and therapeutic, pathways?
So when you talk about community, you talk about getting loved ones around, et cetera, and you ask the question, why didn't we do this earlier? Not just because they need to be there to say goodbye, but do you feel that there's a healing element of that somehow those particular variables start to facilitate healing as compared to the sterilized kind of algorithmic approach?
There's zero question now. There's so much data out there just in the power of a hug and what that does to your neurotransmitter environment and what that does to your stress hormone levels and all of this, what it does to things like telomeres that build the bumper blocks on your DNA. Like, it's just like at every level of human biology, we see human touch, interaction, spiritual connection, create life.
Yeah.
And the effects that has in a hospice setting are pretty profound at oftentimes. To get eligible for hospice care in the United States, you have to have a prognosis of a chronic condition that would suggest that you're going to die in less than 6 months. Then your insurance company or Medicare will kick in and cover your hospice care. It's very common that within those first few weeks, as we peel away all the medicines, peel away all of this, put them back in their homes, surround them by loved ones, have the pastor showing up every week, suddenly the patient's rallied, suddenly the biology is normalized, suddenly you're 3 months in and you're realizing this patient's better than they've been in years, and they just took a trip to the Grand Canyon, and the chance of that person dying in the next few months is 0, and so we better hurry up and discharge that person from hospice before they run out of that, kind of 6-month prognostic reimbursement from Medicare.
And that's not some kind of a crazy outlier that you've seen that
No,
routinely.
This is a common scenario. You're looking at significant portion of patients that will very much stabilize as they come out of that hospital pharmaceutical deluge. It's not uncommon that you're stopping 8, 12, 15 medications on a patient.
Right.
We know that, from a pharmaceutical standpoint, as soon as you're on 6 medications, you are having a drug-drug interaction.
Yeah.
Period.
You have to.
And so you start hitting 8, 10, 12 medications, you've got multiple drug-drug interactions that are disrupting your human biology. You can't even put 2 and 2 together at the biologic level because you have so much chaos going on, so much disruption of normal pathways.
So you were deep in the belly of conventional intervention for cancer, right? You're doing, I think, some chemotherapy research. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, my endocrinology metabolism background was quickly pulled me from kind of hormone medicine into the cancer realm. It began with helping to run the Pituitary Center at the University of Virginia, one of the biggest pituitary tumor centers in the world. So it was a neat place where we're working hand in hand with endocrinologists and neurosurgeons together, kind of tackle these difficult tumors at the base of the brain and in and around the pituitary gland. And there's never been a good toolbox for chemotherapy for these tumors. So when surgery fails, oftentimes you're quickly into a palliative situation. You don't have much therapeutic effect. So I decided to dive in there and see if I could, come up with some new solutions for that patient population. And so I started doing drug development around the interaction of hormone pathways and cancer. And this became, a very incredible journey into understanding for the first time what cancer was, because I had rotated through oncology wards. I saw cancer patients all the time in the hospital settings as an internist, and was consulting all the time on things like breast cancer patients with needing estrogen blockade and all this. So yeah, I was steeped in the cancer world, but when I really started to dig in a laboratory and start to study cancer cells under a microscope, it totally shifted my sense of reality, because I had been told that cancer is a genetic disease. A single cancer cell has an average of about 20,000 unrepaired genetic injuries in it. Knowing that, we just assume, well, that's ground zero for the cancer development, is all these genomic breaks. But what we leave out of that story is that your DNA breaks every time you go out in the sun to the tune of millions of breaks across the body, if not billions of disrupted base pairs, and you go and repair that very quickly. So there's a natural repair system, DNA polymerase enzymes that zip along your DNA strands in every one of your 50, 70 trillion cells to keep you genetically intact. And so it can't really be a genetic injury that is the beginning of the cancer process. It must be an issue of repair. And it's interesting that we don't study repair well. We study dysfunction to the nth degree. We pour billions of dollars of research into dysfunctional cells and then how to palliate those and how to maybe kill those or whatever it's going to be through poisoning of chemotherapy. But nobody is really backed up to that point where they're saying, wow, cellular repair was the initial injury, and where are we going with that? What if we fixed that piece when the genes fix themselves?
So in essence, you're kind of looking through the other end of the telescope, right? Saying maybe it's the body's inherent repair capacity that we maybe need to look at as compared to saying that there's a defective genetic profile that they're born with.
That's right. And you can see the slippery slope here. Once you ask that question, you turn that telescope around and you stop looking at the damaged DNA, you look back upstream, you realize that there is no cancer in the history of mankind that was caused by a lack of chemotherapy. And with that simple realization, no matter how good I was going to get at designing a chemotherapeutic approach for my patients, I was never going to get up that stream. Right. I was never going to stop that cancer from happening. I was never going to change the course of multiple surgeries that fail and then offering a couple of highly toxic drugs at the end of that cascade and then turning them over to one of my hospice and palliative care colleagues. And so that gave me a sense of, after all these decades at that point in academia, the sense that I wonder if the whole paradigm is on its head. Did we spend so much time focusing on disease management that we forgot that there was maybe an opposite and equal to that disease process? Would there be perhaps something called health?
When you were investigating chemotherapeutic agents, you were looking at efficacy, I think, studies. I remember you talking about once, and started to say, wait a minute, our opinion of how well these things work maybe is founded on bad data.
Yeah, it's an interesting reality to the way in which we report clinical trials is that we use all kinds of statistical tricks to make things that are ineffective sound effective. And many ways that we do this, but in a nutshell, one of the tricks that we use is reporting relative risk rather than absolute risk reduction. And by relative risk, we get to say that the risk was reduced for death from this cancer compared to another group. But we never really reported the absolute risk of dying from that tumor.
Right.
And whether that was a relative change that was significant or not, we never mentioned. And so as I was starting to teach chemotherapy science and starting to really dive into that, started to realize that almost nobody was reporting what the patient might think is an important outcome, like, am I going to still be alive in 5 years?
Right.
And so one of the things that we really rarely report and almost never talk about in the cancer literature is that no matter what therapy we've done, chemo, radiation, surgery, some combination of the three, we don't report all-cause mortality. The all-cause mortality is a wastebasket. If you wear it, you suddenly say, okay, I don't care what the patient is dying from. Did they die or are they alive?
Okay.
And so it's that simple dichotomy now of are you alive or dead at 5 years? And with all of our studies that we do, we find that we have very little, if any, effect on all-cause mortality. And so people are dying or living no matter what we do. Instead, what we do, instead of mentioning that they're alive or dead, we say they didn't die from breast cancer.
Right.
They died of a heart attack or some other complication of chemotherapy perhaps, but they didn't die of breast cancer. So then we report that chemotherapy was an effective therapy because it reduced breast cancer-specific death by 15%.
So just to clarify, so if someone has breast cancer, just use your example, and they get an intervention. The intervention causes them to die from something other than specifically the breast cancer. It's not attributed to the fact that this is a fatality related to breast cancer.
Yeah, I mean, you can find those in some of the adverse reaction statistics and everything else, but as far as the regulatory environments and what a patient would be told at the bedside, it's never reported as is there efficacy of the chemo or not? We say this will reduce your risk of dying by 15%, something like that, and that's an absolute risk reduction. Is 15%.
Right.
What we'll do though is we'll say that's an 85% relative risk reduction from this and this, and so we'll make it sound like it's this huge impact.
Wow.
When if you look at the absolute risk reduction, only 15% of the women had any change in course of the death from breast cancer.
So if I'm someone who's has cancer and I'm assessing the risk versus benefit of these varying interventions, especially in chemotherapy, and I'm getting told, 85% positive result with this, based on X, Y, and Z, I better understand the statistical part of it, or have someone consult with me that understands the statistics, because it could be a misrepresentation of what the actual risk versus benefit is. Is that pretty much the summary?
That's a good summary.
Yeah.
To put an example on that, the way that you could think of this as a patient is, how do you ask for the absolute risk reduction? You can say, how many patients are still alive at 2 years or 5 years? And if they say, well, 15% are still alive. And so how many are alive at the end of 2 years or 5 years if they take the medication? Well, that's 7.5%. So, okay, so they went from 15% are alive to 7.5% are alive. And they're going to tell you that chemotherapy is effective at reducing your risk by 50%.
Wow.
Because the relative risk between 15 and 7.5 is 50%.
That's the same game they play with statins.
It's exactly
pretty much right. Say 50% reduction, but it goes from 3 out of 100 to 2 out of 100.
That's right.
And if that's 50%, but it's really
they do it for all of them. Blood thinners and risk of stroke.
Wow.
Because the absolute risk reduction is less than 1.5%, but they'll tell you it's a 60% reduction in risk. And so these relative risk reportings are very dangerous in creating a false reality. So if the risk of dying from stroke is 2%, and now you're going to take a drug to lower that to 1.2%, is that 0.75% risk worth it when you realize that no matter what, 98% of the people are still alive without a stroke at the end of the study?
Right.
And so you start to really look at that absolute risk reduction thing, and it's like, wait a second, I'm going to take a drug for how many years ahead and end up with what real gain? And by the way, the drug causes diabetes and
all the other adverse
heart
effects.
disease and all the other adverse effects that you're looking at.
Right.
And so unfortunately, it's very challenging to advocate for yourself, especially because we're not trained well in math, let alone statistics. Statistics is a whole mess. And, that classic quote of, there's lies and damn lies, and then there's statistics. and so it's just like one of these ways to manipulate data to no end. And so that, I think, is its own challenge. And we could get into a quagmire there as a patient.
Yeah.
But I think it's easier then to, instead of getting stuck there, back up and say, why am I here at all? Why am I even sitting in this chair, listening to a doctor give me a diagnosis and a prognosis and a list of drugs and risk reductions and blah, 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 blah. How did I get here?
Right.
What was my journey?
Right.
And that's where I love starting with patients now is, okay, that's very intense and with poor outcomes, but let's start in a much different space. Let's start to ask, how did you get here? And is there an option to go back upstream? And can we take you to a place where you were prone to collapse, and we can take you to a place where you're prone to repair? And that's been a really exciting journey in my career.
You had, I think, at some point looked at a lot of the studies that were published to get varying chemotherapeutic agents on the market. And then you were looking for replication of these results. What did you find there?
Yeah, so it just gets, the news doesn't get better, unfortunately, as we keep diving into this topic. So Amgen was one of the companies that recently repeated like 53 studies, chemotherapeutic studies that have been real, bellwethers to the industry to say, here's something we can hang our hat on as true. And so those 53 studies have really shaped modern chemotherapy. And they went in and reanalyzed all of that, repeated much of it. And what they found is they could only validate 6% of those studies. 11 of the 53 actually stated their true outcomes. And so through cleaning up that statistical kind of BS that happens, we find that maybe we were basing all of our decisions on an 89% misreporting rate from industry. And the conspiracy theory behind that I don't think even is necessary, because the fact is that's just normal human behavior. We know that there's extraordinary capacity of the human brain to rationalize, deny, justify, and do all these
Confirmation
tricks
bias, yeah.
subconsciously.
Yeah.
And so this is why we have to report our biases and all of this before we go present at a scientific community or whatever. Is we got to say, these are, this is my inherent bias, and it's going to shape what you're about to hear. And that's just a true statement, no matter who you are or what you are. When you then put $4.5–5 billion behind that trial, and a pipeline that's 10 years long and thousands of jobs on the line, you can see how now the bar has ratcheted up so far in risk for the company or your job position as the director of this project. It's almost impossible to have rational behavior at that point. And so it's very important that we start to rethink how we interact with the drug development world as a consumer base, and start to really take it back for drug development for the people, by the people, if you will, and stop just outsourcing that to the pharmaceutical industries.
I mean, it's horrific when you think about it as the patient, someone who's now facing their own mortality. They've got the diagnosis nobody wants to hear. You've got cancer, and now they're going to be taken through what their intervention options are, and then they begin to realize, as they start peeling back the layers a little bit, that this is a tricky road. I don't have the expertise to try to sort this stuff out. They're listening to you right now saying, oh my gosh, I know he's right. I've always intuitively felt it, but I don't know how to sort it out. So this is interesting, because then you said, okay, now I'm the patient. I come and I see you, and you sit down and you say, okay, your first question, I think you said, was, what got us here? So take me through the way that you want to guide them on this journey.
Yeah, so I first want to meet them at where they are right now, because it's the one thing that we miss over and over again in life, I think, in relationship, and especially in this patient-physician relationship, is we forget that they're here right now, and I'm here right now, and that's my most powerful fulcrum to work from. And so if I can slide that fulcrum point from my lever right up to this moment, then whatever I'm going to say next, whether it's about how they got here in the past or where we're going in the future, is going to have a completely different efficacy and a completely different power to it if I've addressed the now. And so when we start now, we have a series of emotions that have to be cleared. Because once you've received these diagnoses, and once you've started to take this diagnosis on an identity, we've started to lock you into a journey of disease and decline. The emotions that are first jump out, of course, are fear, but that's quickly followed typically by guilt. You're suddenly guilty that you can leave your loved ones behind, and you didn't spend enough time with them. You didn't have good work-life balance. You're going to leave your spouse, alone for decades. All of these things start going through a patient's mind when we're faced with this kind of diagnosis. And so that fear-guilt combination sets you up from an endocrine standpoint, from a hormonal situation, to keep fueling the fire of how you got here in the first place, which was kind of a chronic inflammatory, chronic decline, lack of repair state. It's going to accelerate with fear and guilt in the mix. You then add to that the biologic consequences of that high adrenergic or stress state, and you get poor sleep quality, and you get loss of sex drive, and you get short-tempered. And suddenly in the weeks leading up to when I'm sitting with that patient, everything has started to really stress out in the home, and their coping mechanisms are starting to disappear, and relationships are starting to strain, and spouses are missing sleep and are stressed out in fear and guilt and the rest. So the cascades that are there, if they don't get stopped, can block all of my efforts to then start to move that patient back upstream there to a place where they maybe never realized they were, because they were too busy not being in the moment then as well. And so I find it an extraordinary opportunity whenever we come into crisis to say, where am I right this second? And why am I here? And the why I'm here has nothing to do with cancer or anything else. I'm here because decades ago, my parents fell in love, and they created an opening for life in their relationship. And I decided to come through that portal. And I came through probably an ancient soul with an animated energy force defining that. And I interacted suddenly with a particle moment of biology. You know, light energy turning from waveform into particle, becoming solid, and I'm in that. And that is the reality of the situation. I am an ancient soul in a particle moment of a light being, and I'm here on purpose, showed up through my parental line, through my ancestral line, on purpose to be a part of the human experience right now as we stand at the tipping point of our survival or extinction. Well, different foundation now to work from.
Right, yeah.
Should I do chemo? Should I not?
Yeah.
Boom, that's where I like to start with my patients. Now, what are you experiencing right now in that context, on that foundation?
Do you ask them, because I think this becomes kind of interesting as you're talking about maybe the spiritual aspect of this experience, right? So will you ask them about what, faith they might have, if they are faith-based at all in their life, and how that might play a role in their considerations?
Yeah, it certainly, one of the gifts of bedside manner comes from having a little bit of a barometer coming into the situation as to where your patient might be. And so I bring that topic in from 1,000 different directions, depending on what I'm sensing in the situation. I find that if I always start at the science, where I'm starting in biology, then I take them into some physics that they have some vague understanding of, perhaps, or many of them maybe some in-depth experience and belief system around even the science of it. That's an easy entry point into what's bigger than life, what's on the other side of this biology, what is, if it's nothing, then is it just energy, what's there? And so that's where I actually love to start the conversation, because just as firmly as we hold to our cancer paradigm, we certainly hold to our religious paradigm. And both can really limit our opportunity to use either understandings to our full potential. And so even if I'm going to go into a discussion on spirituality, it's very rare that I'll take that from, are you Lutheran, or are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, what's your background? I find that just putting a title on it immediately embeds ancestral trauma, ancestral fear and guilt, ancestral belief systems that are actually perturbing and bending this right now moment with my patient. If we are spiritual beings, then we should have the capacity to connect on nonverbal, non-belief system levels. Long before an English language was ever created was spiritual experience, whether that was a flower interacting with her soil, or a cloud interacting with an ion charge flowing in from outer space. There is spiritual experience, if you want to use the word spirituality, for something called a coherent energy field that seems to have a massive intelligence to it. And so through that, I think that we can start really asking, is fear and guilt actually embedded in my childhood experiences as much from my religion as it was from my, perhaps misunderstanding or no clue of the scientific journey that I would be on in this kind of collapse of health into disease.
It sounds like what you start out with is trying to ascribe some meaning here. Like basically, rather than trying to materialize, in a reductionistic way, here's the pathology you have, here's all this other stuff around it. It's basically coming back saying, let's look at the meaning of life and the meaning of your life, and kind of start from that context. There's also the issue of the loved ones. I mean, I have to imagine that when you're sitting across from a cancer patient, they have a loved one with them very often. How do they play into the whole dynamic that you're describing?
It's fuel on fire, right? And so you've got a patient who's in fear and guilt, and then you add 2 or 3 family members around that are experiencing a different perspective of fear and guilt on the same scenario. And suddenly you have an intractable situation from an emotional state alone. We haven't even touched the biology. And that emotional chaos can be stopped for everybody with the discussion we just had. And so when you freeze the room, around this moment where it's been 2 minutes, 3 minutes since I've laid down that new foundation of realities, we're all here right now, and we're here from a deeper purpose than what we see around us. You can hear a pin drop. People are so slow to speak at this moment because everything's starting to rearrange. The particles are literally clicking in differently. They're left speechless, not because it's complex or heady topic we just hit, but because it changes everything. And so you have this silence in the room which is exactly what the patient needed. One of the most challenging things for a patient is to find a quiet space to start to develop an ethos and a philosophy around how they're going to do this next chapter. And you've spoken eloquently on America's lack of a health philosophy. And every time I hear one of your lectures, I'm always struck with that's exactly what I see at this crisis moment, is a completely ungrounded human being who is being pushed around into things that they never would have done, 10 years ago. If somebody said, would you ever do chemotherapy? That is completely against my belief system. But because nobody had taken through the understanding of what would be the opposite of, no, I won't do that, and nobody helped them go to, what would you do? Then when the moment hits, they end up doing surgery, chemo, and radiation, because it was the only toolbox that was presented to them at that moment. And nature abhors a vacuum, and you left a vacuum there of philosophy. We fill that moment of diagnosis and prognosis with so much data that we make sure there's no space to have enough room to say, oh, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I value. I value time with my children, grandchildren, my spouse, my coworkers, my spiritual community, or a tree. And what is that? That is going to now guide me. If I'm going to do chemo and surgery and radiation, my questions aren't going to be around what's the absolute and relative risk of that chemotherapy. My question is going to be what's the schedule of that chemotherapy regimen, and how is it going to allow me to participate and maximize my time at home and outdoors where I want to be? And is it possible, does it change my prognosis at all if I delay that by 3 months so that I can go and do a sabbatical with my family in Europe where I've always wanted to take them, or go down to Patagonia and hike through the woods with my grandchildren and leave some incredible memories and then engage that? And the reality is, over and over again, the answer is no. There's no data out there to suggest that delaying 3 weeks or 3 months has any impact on your prognosis. And so, but these are not, we are just not given that space. There's such a fear, guilt paradigm put on this that if you're not doing something right now, then you must be suicidal and trying to abandon your family.
And that's exactly, I think, what's put up on people is urgency. Right, and the urgency in and of itself, I think, is destructive to the healing of the person. So basically, if I were to maybe interpret what you're saying, it's healing, or the journey is based on values, not based on analytics or statistics or other things, but saying your own values have to dictate what kind of decisions you're going to make. You think about it. You have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or you have breast cancer, or you have prostate, you have any one of these diagnoses. And at times people might think, well, okay, so there is this specific algorithm you run when you have that particular problem. And what do we know? You can run the same algorithm on 100 people with the exact same condition, and the outcomes are going to be very, very different. So it's not just there's one path, it's a matter of stepping back. And this is what I love about what you're saying, and saying, okay, well, what matters to you? Let's open up a little space, because that's why I tell people when you're attached to your problems and there's no space, you own the problem. You have to put space between you and the problem to have some creativity put into place here, to make the right choice. So what I love about what you're saying is, who's the person? It's who before what. Here's what to do. It's who first, and then we can figure out what. And you didn't say you shouldn't do a chemotherapy at all. I know that there's a lot of misplaced trust in chemotherapy, perhaps, but you're not saying don't do chemotherapy at all. What you're saying is, what matters to you? Maybe there's a way to delay this, and it really doesn't have an impact. These are creative options now that maybe start to give hope where there wasn't some before. Am I interpreting correctly?
Not only is there hope, there's also starting to be an authentic identity that starts to happen. You described it very well with when the problem is not given space from you, you become the problem, and it's inseparable, so it becomes your identity. And we see this, insidiously played on us by the Western medical kind of lexicon all the time. I am diabetic. How many times have you heard that?
Yeah.
Really? That's your identity?
Yeah.
You are a diabetic? Like, that's how insidious it is. Is we've taken away Joe, and we've given him a new name called diabetic. And now he's going to live his identity around that problem. And it's going to dictate how he sees food, how he sees his family, how he sees his free time or lack thereof, how he chooses to do every other thing in the day starts to be dictated by something that's not him. In the same way, this cancer event can quickly, especially because people have this distinct image of like, the cancer's right here in my breast, and it's, you know, attacking me. When in reality, the cancer has found a void of you. There's a vacuum within you that has no self-identity, and the cancer has filled it. You have been so vacant from your own space that you've left the opportunity for this biologic process to get a foothold and fill the space. And so instead of being angry and, you know, being in a warlike attitude towards this cancer, to shift that and be like, oh my gosh, this is like the best friend that comes when you're all up in your head and you're so screwed up on life and you can't figure out your priorities, and your friend comes and says, you just need to come out and have a drink with me. And let's just sit and let's just talk. And after 2 hours of a little space with your friend, you realize you were all up in your head and you just, you know, needed to be reminded that you weren't present here. The tumor's literally a friend coming along saying, what are you doing? You are a light being in a particle moment in a body that you chose as an ancient soul to come into this body and go do something on purpose with. Now this tumor is reminding you that there has been perhaps a separation from this vessel you've been given and the churning energy you've been putting out. The energy that you have externalized has left exhausted and unrepaired and devoid of life, a space within you. That said, one of the most powerful things in kind of creating this space and reversing the fear paradigm is helping each individual understand how tiny this tumor is compared to them. And so a human body is made up of some 50 to 70 trillion human cells. A trillion is a massive number. 50 trillion is this extraordinary number that none of us in a daily life can really comprehend. It happens to be about equal to our national debt, I understand now. But at $50 trillion or 50 trillion cells, it becomes almost irrelevant. There's so many zeros on the end of that one that it's outside of our daily experience. And so we can't really wrap our head around it. And so I try to help my patients start to kind of understand the scope of health that they have in their body at the moment they're diagnosed with a cancer. So you have one tumor cell, and you have 59 trillion other cells that are in their full state of health. And yet we let this one cell, one divided by 59 trillion, become your identity. And now you're a cancer patient. And now this cancer has taken over your psyche and your sense of self and your sense of ethos and your plan and everything else. And so to help somebody kind of laugh for a moment and be like, oh my gosh, I've got this vast ecosystem, this vast universe of self that I'm not even mobilizing because I've shielded myself into this force field of fear and guilt with this one lonely cell that's highly damaged. And then you pull all your loved ones into that sphere. And suddenly the entire family is stuck in this zone of fear with a sense of decay and irreparable damage. And then we, years later, still suffering from the loss of a loved one, find that we haven't been able to break out of that shell. And it takes us years or decades or maybe lifetimes, I think, to really lose the damage, the trauma that's done within this sphere of fear or guilt stuck with one single cell within that came from this vast amount of 50 trillion healthy human cells. When you suddenly back this whole thing up and you say you're a light being having a particle moment, you have this light energy that per cubic centimeter of mitochondria that generates this light energy is some 10,000 times more powerful than the sun, and you are literally a glowing force, and then you choose to be in a particle state where all these atomic events happen in such a structure that you would make a molecule, then a protein, and then a cell, and then a human body, and you're now working in concert across this molecular environment that's so vast and complex no human mind could ever set itself to understand it. And now you're here with me, and we're going to have a spiritual moment of saying why. And remember, we're at a tipping point in all of human history, and you showed up right now to do what, to see what, to feel what. And so this is the moment now where you've blown apart the sphere of fear and guilt around that single cell. And now whatever we reach for has some capacity to do something profound. I have seen chemotherapy heal patients. Better said, I've seen patients heal within the context of chemotherapy. But I've also seen that exact same chemotherapy for that exact same tumor kill somebody very quickly. And so the difference, I believe, comes down to what have you reached for that tool to do? If you're reaching for the tool of chemo, surgery, radiation, for fear and desperation, your chance of survival is extremely low. If you instead come in a sense of power, of I am a light force, I am a force of life that is so much greater than anything in this exam room or this operating room or this CT scan, I literally glow with joy, with love for my family, for life itself. Maybe I'm depressed and that glow is diminished, but I remember having that glow. I remember being a child running down a mountain. I remember swimming, for the first time effectively. I remember riding my bike for the first time. I remember these things of massive joy, and that's me. And I'm now starting to dissect away all of that. And now I'm going to go and realizing that I have 50 trillion healthy cells that just need a little space away from this injured cell population. I just am going to use this chemotherapy for a moment to knock that down, and then I'm going to surge. Totally different paradigm than doc says, I'm going to die, and this is all I've got. So out of my last desperate hope, I'm going to grab onto this drug. And as soon as a couple days in, you're nauseated, vomiting, and then your hair's falling out, and your teeth hurt, and your gums are bleeding, and all that's happening, there was no hope to begin with. So what's your journey going to be? What's the path going to be? The mental wellness that comes out of this spiritual grounding of an event will make you use tools and not hang yourself on a bunch of ropes.
Wow. That's extraordinary context that you don't hear at all. You're really out there. What are your considerations on alternative things, varying forms of dieting or fasting and such, nutritional supplementation, IVs of maybe, different vitamins? Do you, I know it's kind of a broad question, but, do you incorporate other tools like that personally that you think that these things can be effective?
I think the field of, what might be called integrative medicine or functional medicine now being used a lot as a catch term, as there's been a new kind of specialty kind of created around this thing called functional medicine, has made one massive error in that they've gone and kicked that allopathic medical doctor off the stool, gotten right back up on the same stool and said, got a different toolbox. You've got cancer, you're going to die in 2 years. We got to attack this with everything we're going to do. Go and tell the exact same story that doctor just did with the same intensity of fear and guilt as to why they need to come into your office 3 times a week and do vitamin C drips and spend thousands of dollars a month and laser therapy. And if you don't do it all, then the cancer will sneak out and get you. And I hear the same patterns of speech and behavior, which means that as we started to admit the limitations of the pharmaceutical industry, we failed to create a space for a new paradigm to emerge. We just rushed in with maybe a more earth-based kind of concept of, well, maybe this is less toxic, but we didn't break the paradigm.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's really just still the same disease treatment model. You're just using less toxic stuff to do it. And there's something to be said for less toxicity maybe sometimes. But ultimately...
the caveat, though, that I might stop there with is it's not... without toxicity, I've seen a lot of patients die from complications of, herbal and naturopathic compounds used especially incorrectly. Something like vitamin C is a potent oxidant acting very similar to a chemotherapy. And I've seen patients go into full-fledged, organ failure from 50 grams of vitamin C.
Wow.
And so we have to be very cognizant as physicians, is because it sounds like a vitamin, that does not mean you even understand what the heck that thing is. Vitamin C is literally a delivery system for hydrogen peroxide. And so hydrogen peroxide kicks off all kinds of reactive compounds, ozone, all kinds of compounds that damage DNA and destruct cell membranes and all kinds of things. And you do that in hopes that you're going to get an antioxidant response from the body and then kind of hopefully work the patient back out of that inflammatory crisis that you just created. But I can tell you that's the same thing the chemotherapy doctor is doing. They're trying to give just enough toxin to induce an antioxidant response. And so it's a misperception that these two things are different. And so we have to be very cautious. If we have set out to kill a cancer cell, no matter your tool, then chances are you haven't broke the paradigm and the patient is living in fear and guilt and you're in a warlike mentality rather than a moment of spiritual acceptance and understanding of the power that is in this moment. And you've missed an opportunity to have a human, spiritual, soul connection to the patient and yourself as a practitioner, and you're going to end up down the same pathway with no better results. Because if we don't really get up to that stream as to why they ended up in your room, it doesn't matter the toolbox you have, you're going to have the same outcomes. Some patients will survive, some will die, and you as a naturopathic or holistic or integrative or functional, doesn't matter your pretext, you will have the same inability to tell that patient in front of you whether or not everything you're going to bring is going to work or not, as that pharmaceutical doctor who's sitting there with a complete inability to tell you this is going to work or not. One of the fascinating things about statistics is that the first thing you find out in Stats 101 is that you can never apply a population statistic to an individual. And so if you do a study and you prove in these 10,000 patients, we did the same thing and it was perfectly designed, and we're going to tell you the real results, and it was an absolute risk reduction of 30% or whatever your thing, if you could then go and tell one patient that this drug is going to reduce by 30% your risk, you just lied. Yeah. It is statistically impossible to do that. You can never apply that population statistic to the individual. That individual has a 50-50 chance no matter what the study showed. Either it's going to work in them or it's not going to work in them. And the study has no bearing on that. And so I find it fascinating that every doctor sits around all day long telling patients all of these statistics, telling them that that applies to them as an individual. This is going to change your individual risk of dying from cancer by 30%. And the reality is it's either 50-50. And we're going to have to go in this together. And if that's where the doctor sat down, how much of a different journey. Instead of worrying, on your journey, am I going to be of the 30%? If you had somebody sit down and say, it's you and me, we're going in with a 50-50 shot. We're going to take it a day at a time. I'm going to love you through it, and you're going to love me through it. I'm going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. We're going to have either an opportunity to change this thing, or we're going to learn everything we can from this. We're going to suck the marrow out of this experience, and we're going to do this thing to the optimal benefit, not just of you, but for the human experience in it, so that we would inform humanity as a whole in our partnership as a one-on-one. If that was our journey into cancer, we would have crushed this thing a long time ago, I think. Wow. But it's because we fiddle away with the numbers and we keep saying you're somewhere out in that population and it's this nebulous thing, and there's no sense of the real numbers, which is either it's going to work or not. And let's do this together. And we're going to be on that journey, and we're going to bring all the tools to bear. We can reach for chemo, we can reach for vitamin C, we can reach for whatever is in that toolbox, but never out of desperation, never out of some over-expectation that that's where health comes from. Health has never come from an IV bag. I don't care what you put in that. I don't care if that's a vitamin C or a vitamin B or a steroid. I don't really care what's in that bag. It's never developed health. Nothing has ever been born out of something from a plastic bag. And so we have to really be cautious about how we explain these tools to patients so that it doesn't dwarf their power. Their power is I am here right now, and right now, and right now. And if I'm going to set intention for another right now, I can do crazy cool things. I've seen patients who have terminal diagnoses. I've got one patient in my clinic. She was diagnosed with multifocal breast cancer in 1984. She fired the doctor immediately, said, I don't have cancer. She's fired subsequently 16 doctors who would even mention the word cancer to her. She has never done any treatment for it. She's now in her 80s. She has multifocal breast cancer. It's so obvious on exam. She got a chest x-ray for pneumonia recently. Not only is it in her breast, it's in her lungs. She's never had a wheeze. She's never had a pain. She's never had blood out of the breast. She's never had any problem, and I think it has a hell of a lot to do with the attitude of, that is not me, doc. You might see little ditzels of something on some x-ray, but I am me, and I'm going to hold my boundaries, and I'm going to live life to the fullest, and she has. And that fascinates me. It really teaches me again that if you are going to be so full of hubris that you'd even say the word cancer, then you better educate quickly that this is just a word. It describes one cell that got separated from the whole. It is actually the loneliest cell in your body. And in its loneliness, it accumulated damage. It got so damaged it could no longer kill itself, which is a natural defense mechanism called apoptosis, or programmed cell suicide. Cancer cells lose that capacity. They go past that injury point, and so they go past this kind of point of no return, and now with no ability to actually do any healthy behavior and no ability to repair itself and no ability to kill itself, all it can do is replicate. So now you have a damaged lonely cell replicating, and we call that a tumor. And then we make up these stories about cancer and metastases and all these things, when in fact, you just have a lonely population of cells looking for a home.
Well, I think this is a riveting and stimulating conversation, to say the least. And boy, is it an important one that people need to hear. So I can't thank you enough for coming here and being unabashed about your views of things and sharing them with us. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Very cool. I would say that there's a real opportunity we have as a people right now to take a look at the macro lessons that we could learn from the microscopic journey of cancer. What we're finding with cancer is that a cell that's separated from its community becomes lonely, starts to become desperate, and it's desperate towards life, which is interesting. It never loses its drive for life. And so the fabric of every cell is life and a drive for it. And in so doing, it will start to overcome the good of the whole, and it will start to extract nutrients, reserves, and start to become selfish in its behavior and ultimately kill the larger organism for itself. And I think if we back up for a moment, we'll realize this is exactly what we're doing as a society, as a people, is we have empires that rise and fall with the characteristic of becoming isolated and isolating themselves from the greater surrounding, failing to be able to produce enough energy for themselves, and so they start extracting energy from peoples greater than their own community, and in that they find the need for war, and they find conquest and empire, so they can get more and more energy into the tumor, and they take over, and then they get to this point where the tumor starts to collapse from within, because every tumor has a rotting core in the end, and as the core rots, it collapses and the empire disappears. And then you look at our species as a whole. We started in an indigenous reality where we lived in concert and balance with a biome, an ecosystem. We learned to hunt and grow and live spiritually, physically, metaphysically with nature, from nature, learn from her, co-create with her, and then we learned conquest, and we started to grow past the tribe, and we started to act as a tumor on the earth itself. And so now we are extracting life out of the planet and failing to realize that we are extracting from one space and putting it all into our atmosphere, or putting it all into the heavy metals of our food. And instead of returning them to their natural place of the soil itself, we break the cycles of life in our conquest, and we are now killing a whole planet. And we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction, losing some 50% of life on Earth in just the last 40 years. A species disappearing every 20 minutes. Why? Because we've become this extraordinary tumor of 7 billion cells that are acting in concert together to become even more efficient and more aggressive consumers next year than we are this year. And then we're consuming a planet that sits in the black vacuum of space. And so in the context of that story, realizing we are becoming the terminal cancer on a planet, if we are going to go and embark on a physician's journey of healing our patients, then we better make sure that we do a parallel macro story and macro journey with them, because if we heal more patients, if we reduce the amount of chronic disease, if we improve the rate of fertility on this planet, and we don't change our macro behavior, we all disappear faster. The planet disappears faster. And so the journey that we have right now as a science community, as a consumer community, as a patient population, is to completely redefine not the story of cancer, but the story of life and what life connected would look like. And if we can connect a cell back to its original organism, it immediately eliminates itself to allow a stem cell to come in and regrow healthy tissue and expand into a more vibrant, more healthy human being on the flip side of that. If we can come to terms with what we are as a species, functioning disconnected from a mother nature, and in so doing becoming that sucking noise, that consumptive power that's destroying life around us, and we come to that moment of realization and we plug back into Mother Nature, we tear down the walls that separate our nations. We tear down the tariffs that separate commerce and a global economy. We start to tear down the religious and political infighting and everything else that separates mankind, and we overcome the cancer-like behavior of civilization itself. It's one of the two now, and we're down to decades left to find out which way it tips. I'm glad to be alive, glad to be alive with a brilliant mind like yours. I'm so glad that everybody in the audience is contributing to a hyper-intelligence right now as we pause, take a moment, and agree that we're alive, and we're vibrant, and we're on purpose.
So beautifully stated. Zach, thanks so much for taking the time and sharing all this wisdom with us. I really appreciate it.
So glad to be here.
I don't know about you, but I would like to try to spend as much time as possible with Dr. Zach Bush. He's an amazing man, extraordinary vision, unbelievable caring for humanity, and somebody that we all need in our lives. So we were really happy to share him with you for these few moments here.
A Love Letter to My Mom by Jeff Hayes. I had no idea that my love letter to my mom would also be a love letter to Dory, the love of my life. I am imprinted with cancer. I didn't die from it, I lived it. My mom, my son, and the love of my life. Dory, please live. Dear God, please let Dory live. This is just my story. One small story, played out millions of times in millions of others. But oh God, please let Dory live.
Utah's Division of Child and Family Services once tried to force the parents of a boy named Parker Jensen to have him undergo chemotherapy for Ewing sarcoma. That polarizing, highly publicized case began more than 5 years ago and has continued since then in the courts.
A federal court yesterday threw out a lawsuit from the parents of Parker Jensen, but the boy's family says their battle is far from over.
I remember the call. The oral surgeon said, hey, you need to come on in and we need to discuss the results. And he sat us down and he says, your son has cancer. And how devastating that was to hear that your 12-year-old has cancer.
When that MRI came out, there was nothing there. They could not find anything in the MRI, and that was our first kind of, I guess, relief. Like, whoo, it's not as bad as they had said it to be. And they did, a bone scan, and that came out negative, and they did a CT scan, and they did chest x-rays and all these things to try to find some cancer, and every one of those tests came out negative. Yet the doctor still kept saying, well, we still expect you to come, Thursday morning to start chemotherapy.
He said I had invisible cancer and that I had to do chemotherapy anyways.
We saw all these efforts to try to just rush and railroad the Jensens and Parker into chemo. That's not normally the way doctors behave. Almost a year of chemo with bad side effects is not something that responsible parents would agree to without being satisfied this is really the right thing.
My dad printed off a huge list of all the chemotherapy drugs. I remember looking through all of them, seeing what they did, side effects of each drug, how many there were.
On a lot of the drugs that were just going to make you a little bit sick, as we were told, we found out 2% of the people die, just flat out die. Others have major organ damage, tissue damage, brain damage, sterility.
Initially we thought maybe it's just ego.
The doctor that we weren't supposed to see, but we happened to see, had sponsored a clinical trial for a particular disease, Ewing sarcoma, and it was about ready to be shut down unless they got more 12-year-old white male subjects. The pathologist in the lab was pressured into assigning it Ewing sarcoma. They haven't even taken a blood test yet. and they were forcing chemotherapy, and they reported to the state that he had 2 weeks to live.
If people know that they have that ability, that power, it's just a matter of time before somebody will abuse it.
My parents have always known best, and I can't really ever say that they've ever made a mistake parenting-wise.
Early on, he looks up at Barbara and I and he says, "Mom, Dad, I'm not sick." And it just solidified in us that we're right. He is not sick, and we got to fight this.
Now the case goes to the state court and the Federal Court of Appeals, where the Jensens hope there is a final decision on whether their right to decide what is best for their son was violated.
I didn't want chemotherapy because looking back on all the tests, like they were telling me that they were negative. The doctors were saying that they were negative. Everyone's saying that it was clean. I don't want this, that I want them to just leave us alone.
That's when we were threatened that they would take him away, and we had 3 days to get our case together against the state. We finally found the Brzezinski Institute. We were going to take Parker to have this second opinion. When they found out, they issued warrants for our arrest. Little did we know that the fight would be World War Jensen.
Here the fundamental charge was that you were somehow negligent parents. Negligent because the government knows best.
We would get to a point of disparity where you had the feds looking for you, you had the local police, you had the state police. We're basically in exile because we have these warrants out for us.
One night Darren said, if I go to jail, you are not to bring Parker back. You are not to turn him in. And Darren was charged with kidnapping his own son and because they were neglecting to treat him.
For several weeks, my family was on the lam, I was in jail. I mean, I'm willing to be responsible if I make a wrong decision. That's what parents are for.
Darren and Barbara Jensen charged with kidnapping and medical neglect because they refused chemotherapy for their son.
What really kills me is at the end they said that we didn't win, we just didn't lose either.
Yeah, it was our non-loss.
When one hears the word today, Amazon, they think about Jeff Bezos or they think about what they're ordering online. But when we talk about Amazon John Easterling and his wife Olivia Newton-John, and there's quite a story there.
John Easterling has been an advocate of the rainforest for years and years. He owns an herb company. He's made a career of bringing back healing herbs. A lot of the pharmaceutical drugs we have are from originally were things that we found in the rainforest. He's also, with Olivia, been instrumental in as an advocate for cannabis and especially for being available for cancer patients. But Olivia played a key role in my life when my son Charlie was passing away. He passed away in Malibu and spent many days at her house. She was a really tremendous friend to him. And so it's interesting to see this come full circle, and she's a fascinating person and a fascinating story.
This is an interview that integrates a husband with a vision, a wife with cancer, who also happens to be a celebrity. There's a lot to pick up here, so tune in. Olivia, John, thanks so much for taking the time to sit with us and have this conversation and share your experiences.
Very welcome.
Yeah, great to be with you, Patrick.
Starting with you, Olivia, you've had really quite a cancer journey. Can you overview that for us and share that experience?
Do you have a few hours? Well, it started in 1992 when I was first diagnosed with breast cancer. And I pretty much did conventional treatment in the beginning because I was afraid not to be honest. I had a young child. And even though I was terrified of chemotherapy and hoped that I wouldn't have to do it, I ended up doing a 9-month course of chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. I didn't have radiation, but I always took a lot of care of myself during my treatment. So I was able to, I learned meditation, I had acupuncture, I took homeopathic things, I took herbs, thanks to John. Actually, that was later, but thanks to John, who was my friend back then. Meditation. I did everything that I could in every other realm to support my body going through chemotherapy. And I had surgery. I had a modified radical mastectomy in the very beginning. And then, I'd always been pretty healthy eater and a healthy liver. I wasn't a big drinker or anything, and ate well and exercised. So it was like, why me, why not me kind of thing. I actually wrote an album about that with that very title, because it was a surprise, like it is for every woman that gets breast cancer. Then basically I was all right for almost 25 years. Was it 25, 24? I'm terrible with years. But anyway, about 6 years ago, I had another recurrence of metastases, and I, in the beginning, treated it just with herbs and natural products, and went to a wonderful clinic in Georgia where John's best friend was running this wonderful clinic, and I had a lot of IVs of minerals and vitamins and a bunch of other things that John will know the names of, I don't, and did pretty well, and I did very well. And then, help me with the years, honey, 2 years ago?
Then
3 years ago.
You got the car accident.
Oh yeah,
right?
that was 6 years ago. Yeah, my sister was very ill. She was dying, unfortunately, tragically, of glioblastoma, and John and I were driving back from where we live now to be with her, and had a car accident, and the seatbelt hit my right side, which is where I'd had my mastectomy. And I noticed I was in a lot of pain because I jarred my shoulder, but I did notice a lump had come up, and I had it checked out. And at the time, they didn't think it was anything. Yep. So we treated it again with natural therapies, and I seemed to be fine. And then 3 years ago, like 3 years after that, I had started having sciatic problems, which I thought were sciatic problems, and long story made short, it ended up being that I had a metastases in my sacrum, and I had a fracture in my sacrum. And the amazing thing about this is that over the last 18 years, I have lent my name to a cancer wellness centre in Melbourne, Australia. And I ended up being in my own centre to be healed with this metastases to the sacrum. I was in a lot of pain. I could hardly walk, although I had just completed a walk to raise money for my hospital, which is the irony of it. The same day I ended up in my centre. And I did have some radiation on the metastases because I had quite a few around my body. And that was my last treatment in hospital. Since then, I've been taking a lot of herbs, using a lot of natural therapies, and of course, medicinal cannabis, which is my husband's specialty, and has been keeping me pain-free, and I believe has helped me greatly return to better health and well-being. So in a nutshell, that's been my journey. You want to add anything? Because you remember much more than I do.
Yeah, I remember when we had the car accident, right? So we got rear-ended, so you had the soft tissue trauma in this area here where the seatbelt was. And it was the same time that, Rona, your sister was passing away. So there's a lot of emotional trauma going on. And then you compound that with some physical trauma. I think we see in the literature and recognize it with other people, that kind of combination really compromises a specific space, and that's oftentimes where cancer has an opportunity to set up. So the first time once it was seen there, the protocol that we were doing, I remember we went back to the radiologist. This was before you're doing any of the radiation that came years later, with your sacrum issue. And we're looking at the pictures there, and he said, wow, everything seems to be moving in the right direction here. And so, your treatment is really working. What is it? So we explained, because at that point it was exclusively Amazonian botanicals and cannabis. And so he took a real interest. There's just a huge area of interest in this. We see from your general practitioners and your radiologists, because when they see something that is very unusual in their practice, sometimes they just blow it off. It used to be a lot like that. I found from working with practitioners for 30 plus years. But now you see a lot more taking a genuine interest, like, whoa, because they're recognizing, that there's an extraordinary universe of entities out there that we can be using. And so that was really, really a positive thing. Mm-hmm. And during this last work after that radiation, when she was in a hospital with a fractured pelvis, and that
I had to learn to walk again.
It was like a month flat on her back.
Wow.
And so coming out of that, it's been quite extraordinary to see the surprised look on their faces when they see her again. That was in Australia. We went back in a year, and she was better than ever. And there was a lot of surprised folks down there, which is really quite wonderful. And
so I've kind of used a holistic approach, like use the best of what we need at the time. And I believe that, keeping the body healthy and boosting the immune system rather than poisoning the body is the way we need to go, because just logically it makes more sense to help the body strengthen and fight the cancer cells than to weaken it and kill things within it. I mean, I've done both, so I understand, which is good. I'm glad I had that experience, because if I hadn't had that experience with chemotherapy and radiation, I wouldn't be able to understand the patients in my center and be able to talk to people about what they should do. I think you need to decide what feels right for you. But I think that, boosting your immune system while you're going through treatment, and particularly the mind immune system, this thing up here is the most important organ of all, I think, in the healing yourself from cancer, because no one's going to heal you. You have to heal yourself. No matter what you're partaking in, you have to believe that this is working and tell your body what you want it to do. And I have never fought cancer. It hasn't been a war for me, because I don't believe wars. I'm not a warring person, and I don't like conflict, and it doesn't work for me that way. So I try to talk to my body and tell the cancer cells that I don't really need them anymore, but if they want to stay, then they need to just do what they're doing. And I heard actually Zach Bush speak, and he spoke about integrating the cancer cells back into your body, because they're the weaker cells, help them become stronger and go back into your body as stronger cells. So I am a great follower of Louise Hay, and she was a wonderful help to me in the first time that I went through breast cancer in 92. Admire her greatly, and the way that she put together the mind and the body and the different. It goes back to Chinese medicine too, who believe that the different organs represent different emotions, and therefore where your cancer comes through you is somehow related to some emotional experience. That, for me, rang true. And I do believe that when we don't express our emotions or deal with them, that they're going to show up somehow in our body in some form.
Olivia, thanks for mentioning Dr. Zach Bush. He's a dear friend of mine, and I think an amazing thinker, and has a lot to say specifically on this topic. One of the things I was really enthralled with is your mindset as you're explaining your story. And before we get to John's backstory, I just want to kind of bring up this idea that there's this militant attitude toward cancer, towards we have a war on cancer, we have to fight it, and these types of phrases and words where it's like this battle doesn't seem to be the way that you're thinking and the way that you approach it and how you experience cancer, live with it, and work through it. So it was really, to me, amazing that you reframe it this way for yourself, and I think it's a pretty important thing to highlight.
How can you heal when you're at war with something? How can you be, you need to be at peace with your body, because stress is like the worst place you want to put. You don't want to put your body into a stressful situation. You want to keep it calm. And I don't think about it a great deal. I just, I talk to my body and I try to treat it well. But I think it's incredibly important how you think about it. I think, obviously I have moments of fear because I'm a human, and, having had breast cancer for how many years now is it? On and off, a long time. It's part of me now, it's like I live with it and I live well with it. And I think that's another way of thinking about it. You may not ever be able to get rid of every single cell and keep pounding the body with all these chemotherapy drugs and things to try and kill every cell. But you can live well with it if you keep it at bay. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I think it's, if I was chime in on that, it's so important, the tape that's playing in the back of our heads, because oftentimes there's a tape playing that's not really conducive to the fullest expression of our health with people. And I try to, make the point that be careful with what you're thinking, because every cell in your body is listening to that, and you're programming them to be in that state. And I do like a little example, because we have an opportunity to, I think, elevate every cell in our body every day. We certainly do, but a good thing is to ask somebody, how they are. Hey, how you doing? And you hear a lot, I'm hanging in there, I'm getting along, I'm okay, I'm, whatever. And then they normally respond, and how are you? And that's where you've got the opportunity. I always say I'm fantastic, I'm supernatural, I'm out of this world, because I know every cell in my body is listening, and they're all saying, oh, wait a minute, look, we need to come up a couple of notches here, right? And it really wakes everything up, and it's quite surprising how many people have adopted that same thing, because they know that it makes them feel better right away. And we are supernatural. I mean, we are extraordinary and wonderful beings, and so we need to express that and let those tapes play in our head, because you've got network programming going on all the time.
Yeah, I love that expression that John says, be careful what your mind is thinking, because your body's listening. But don't say out of this world, because that could mean that. I don't want that.
It could be. That could be.
I want you to stay here.
I'm one of the good guys.
When I was growing up, my mother always said to me, when you're talking to yourself, watch your language.
Oh, I like that. That's great.
You're a lucky guy. You're a lucky
woman,
guy to have a mom like that.
I am quite fortunate, and there's a lot more that I want to dig into here. But before I do, let's talk to John. You're referred to very often as Amazon John, but we're not talking about Amazon.com. You actually went down to the Amazon and have spent an extraordinary amount of time there. So tell us about what got you interested in all that.
Yeah, I was interested in the Amazon rainforest. I saw a kid when I was in the 3rd grade. We get these weekly readers, and it always had a story in there about a kid your age in another part of the world doing something fantastic. And so it was always inspiring. I couldn't wait for those weekly readers. And then one week, there it was, the kid was in Peru up in the highlands, hanging out with the llamas. And I thought, that's for me. There was just a connection, like a heart-space connection there. And that's what I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't, none of the adults at the time thought it was appropriate that somehow I was able to get to Peru. So it was kind of a dream deferred for a long, long time till I got done with school at the University of North Carolina. And the only asset I had was this old car. So I sold the car and bought a ticket to Ecuador, and I went down essentially looking for treasure. And I had kind of a plan there that I was going to go down and find the lost cities of gold or Inca treasure, and that was the plan. There wasn't a backup plan. There wasn't a plan B. I just sold the only asset I had. so I was really committed to find treasure, and didn't find any lost cities of gold or Inca treasure in a few weeks, but I did pick up some artisanias and some handicraft things and brought them back and sold them and had enough money for another ticket. So that's what started back in the early 70s, the whole journey that I was on. And I went through a series of treasure. That was a treasure for a while. And then we actually and we got into some lost civilization, Chimu material on the north coast of Peru. It's a pre-Inca civilization, and had material for museums and collectors. Then I got into Brazil with a lot of leather goods, and then in Argentina, and ultimately started going into the Amazonian rainforest. And that's where things really shifted. I had in 1970, when I was in college, I had hepatitis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and actually had a near-death experience in a hospital in North Carolina, which was the most spectacular experience of all. But coming out of that, I was still a bit compromised. I felt like I was about 60% of where I used to be. And you see this a lot in people that have a traumatic injury or some kind of serious disease, and get to that level as they come back. They never quite get all the way, And the doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, and I just accepted that. I didn't know any better. And so when I was in Peru, so I kept, this is part of the Andean journey and the Brazilian, Argentinian, Peruvian, Ecuador, Bolivian phase, and I started getting into the Amazon rainforest and seeing some Shipibo, Canibo Indians there, and some of the work that they were doing. And on the Rio Ucayali, just kept getting further and further kind of upriver and collecting some utilitarian items, blowguns, ceramics, things like that. And that was really fascinating, completely different world than the highlands. Okay, now you're in here with 200,000 species of plants, of which we've really only looked at from a therapeutic standpoint a tiny 3%. Yet almost a third of our pharmaceuticals come from the footprint of those plants. Mm-hmm. But all this was oblivious to me. I was just going for treasure until I had this kind of a relapse and just fell down sweating, and it was just like everything was coming back on me. They looked at me and just wandered off into the bush and came back with Uña de Gato, Chanca Piedra, a few drops of Sangre de Drago, and boiled up these teas. And I started drinking those, and things shifted pretty dramatically and very quickly for me. I mean, the fevers and everything broke in a day, and after 3 days of doing that, I realized, what? I'm feeling better. I'm feeling now, the mental acuity, the sense of groundedness, the awareness, the feeling of peace in your immediate environment, all of that just really came back. And I thought, this is I'm as good as I am before I was sick. And even more extraordinary was after another 3 days, it was like I said, I'm at a higher level of life experience than I've ever been. And all I had done was to incorporate some of the density of chemistry and the energetics and the microbials and everything that's in that density of the rainforest, and incorporated that into my body, and that integrated in a way that all of my body's organs and systems started coming up to a new level. Your heart, spleen, thymus, lungs, liver, everything is saying, wow, look what's in the bloodstream now. Look at this material. We've never had this chemistry or this energetic or this informational imprint. Now look what we can do. So all these organs started coming up and responding to this incredible new resource of material, and I was just kind of just a recipient of all this as a giant gift, and whoa. And so that was the beginning of Amazon Herbs. So it shifted from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I was doing a lot of gemstones from mines in Brazil and everything, from Raiders of the Lost Ark into the Amazon Herb Company.
Which was the real treasure you discovered.
Yeah, and after all this, I thought all these years I was going down looking for treasure, chopping the treasure down, wondering it's growing right out of the ground.
Yeah, this is what was occurring for me as you were telling your story, that the real treasure was what you found in these herbs and these plants in the Amazon as compared to what you originally went there for. And what I find fascinating about the story is how you and Olivia eventually sync up, and looking at what her life's experience was and the type of things you were working on and how you came together, you get married, and now here you are all these years later. It's kind of interesting how these two lives came together and what the foundations of these lives were. And I say this because a big part of the cancer story is not just the person with the cancer, but their loved ones and what kind of meaning we ascribe to cancer. So you have this unique perspective because of all the work you've done in looking at these plants and these plant medicines and how they can help people who have certain illness. But now when it's your soulmate, a person that's close to you and you're applying this, that's sort of like the real test of faith, if you will, as far as how you go into this, how you do this together as compared to here's a patient and here's a person with some remedies and let's see how this works for them. No, there's a lot more intimacy in the whole process here. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring is how people find meaning in cancer and loved ones together go through this journey. So with this deeply personal experience, did it shape you at all? Did it maybe shake any of the foundations of the personal truths you were living by. How did it affect you?
Well, yeah, well, of course. Obviously there's an obvious yes answer to that. And kind of the way we got connected really goes back to a healing. Olivia and I had known each other for a number of years. I never was an Olivia fan. I'd never seen Grease till after we were married. I didn't own any of her music. It just wasn't my genre. I'm
happy about it.
I'm upriver in the Bolivian rainforest in a dugout canoe, right? And I didn't know what was happening up here. But when I met her at a kind of a charity fundraiser, and we got to know each other, I began to realize, and I'd see her every year at the same function, and I said, "Wow, this is just a really genuine person. This is amazing."
Surprise!
Yeah, it was a surprise because I assumed if you're from Hollywood, you must be an idiot, a shallow nutcase.
That doesn't change, but
And so anyway, hey, she really cares about animals. I saw that right up front. She really cares about plants. She cares about the plants. She's really smart. She's funny, and she cares about people, and she does, and she's got an ability to care about people in a sincere way that I've never seen before. The capacity that she has to really care about so many people. So and that's all very, so we got to be good friends from all of this. And she invited me to a concert. I'd never been to one of her concerts, so I went down to Miami, and the backstory is that this went on for like 20 years, another 20 years before, we saw each other.
He's
in
a
different
slow
way.
starter, Patrick. What can I tell you?
And but I was doing a rainforest seminar in Malibu, and it got to be late, and she was there, and the seminar was over, and so she said, "Well, if you want to stay in my guest house, you can just stay in my guest house." So I did, and the next morning I was driving back to LAX, and the sun got me in the eyes. I drove off a cliff and totaled the car and fractured my spine. And
anything not to leave me, really. That's what I think.
Yeah. I'm sure that's the way it was playing. But it turned out to be a very fortunate experience. Because in the emergency room, I was asking for all these Amazon herbs, that I knew were anti-inflammatory and great for pain, and they didn't have them. But I knew Olivia had a stash because I sent her a bunch of stuff. And so actually she came. I said, "Take the pictures. I want to see what this looks like. But I don't want, I could use those painkillers. They had, the big syringes. I need some recovery formula." And
I couldn't believe it. He refused to have, the car had landed upside down, didn't it, on the road. He dropped like 80 feet or something, fractured something in his back. He wouldn't take a painkiller, but he wanted his own herbs, Mercabazon, which is a miraculous thing, gotta say.
Yeah.
So when he came back to my house, Chloe, who was a little girl, my daughter, and I ended up massaging his back with this wonderful liquid of his. And he spent the night on my couch that night because he was in so much pain. And my dog, I had an Irish setter at the time. This is part of the story. And the Irish setter slept by him. And the next morning he wanted to go back. His girlfriend was going to pick him up and all this stuff. So I obviously inquired how he was a little bit later. And I told him at that time that my dog was pregnant. I didn't accuse him of anything, but the dog was pregnant. And I wondered if he would like a puppy because we were going to have a bunch of puppies. And he did actually take a puppy and another one for his friend. And I shipped these two dogs to Florida, and I didn't see the dog or John for maybe 5 years, I think. And then I invited him to the concert, and I said, "Bring your girlfriend," but he brought the dog. And so that's really how we reconnected.
Well, yeah, but it was
They
at the
both
concert.
remembered me amazingly.
Yeah, that's how I got to the concert. Now, what happened at the concert is really of specific value, I think, to our conversation. And that was, as the lights went down, it's a little intimate auditorium, about 2,000 people. The lights went off, and I heard these like Bolivian cañas, these flutes, these Highland Andean flutes were playing. And I looked around, I thought, maybe am I the only one hearing that? And then Olivia walked out on stage and started singing this song, Pearls on a Chain. And that song, when people were weeping all around me, there was this healing moving through the audience. And, as I was watching her, I got it. I got it that she's a healer, and this music and the lyrics are just a medium of her healing.
Yeah.
And she may not even understand the effect she's having on that audience. And all I could think of was, I need to get her to Peru to meet the healers that I work with down there. So I work with a variety of curanderos with the plant medicine. And so after the concert, I approached her and asked her if she'd like to go to Peru and meet these curanderos. Oh, I know. I walked to her and said, I know who you are. You're a healer.
So thanks,
She
John.
looked at me like,
I was wondering.
After 20 years, hey, I know who you are. It's a big breakthrough.
He did.
And she said yes. And I thought, oh no, now I'm taking Olivia Newton-John to the Amazon rainforest. And it was about 6 months that we kind of planned the trip. And the couple that had actually introduced us in a very beginning of knowing each other, I invited them to go as well, because just to make things proper. And again, all I wanted to do, I just wanted to get these healers connected, because they're very powerful, potent healers in the Amazon. And I recognized what Olivia's song was doing and has done, for years and years. It's just the nature of what she's been doing. But I recognized at that moment and wanted to make that connection. And when we got to the rainforest, a series of things happened where I took her out into our camu fields, into a nice double canopy rainforest, and I had one of the Shipibo curanderos and ayahuasqueros meet us there, worked with the ayahuasca medicine, and which they had encouraged me to do many years before for my interest in plant medicine, just to open up the communication to the plants in a more meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And so I like to, when I take people down there, and I took groups down every year for 20 plus years, but I like to introduce them to this specific medicine because they consider it the mother medicine of all the medicines.
So he asked us all to just take a little tiny sip, because I was afraid of it. I knew what it was, and he told me it would be probably good for you to do this. I said, no, I don't like any mind-altering things. I was terrified. He said, well, just taste it. So literally, it was the cap of a Coca-Cola bottle. You know how small they are, and half of that. And I tasted it, and I actually liked it. And John was totally surprised. I said, oh, this tastes good.
No one likes the flavor.
I must have needed it.
It's foul.
So we go back to this beautiful little, it was like a shack on the edge of one of the tributaries of the Amazon. And I had a beautiful cabin looking out onto the water. And in the middle of the night, we were supposed to go upstream 4 a.m. to one of the beautiful Shipibo camps where John was kind of the godfather. They were going to give us a feast. And I woke up at 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning feeling really, really ill, and told my friends to tell John that you better go without me because I feel really sick and I better not go. I've got a bug or something. So John came down to check me out and immediately realized what was wrong. He could see it was the ayahuasca, and because I'd had so little of it, I had no clue that that's what was happening, but I was throwing up and I was not feeling too good. And so he came to the door and said,
I explained to her that, I know you well enough now. I know you're just really sensitive. And so the ayahuasca just opening up the channels of communication. We're the density of a rainforest. So we have thousands of species of animals and birds and plants and insects. And so, you're just integrating all of this information at such a high download.
And I said, no, I'm disintegrating. Let's get this right.
She said, no, I'm disintegrating.
So he stayed with me all night, and I had some unbelievable visual experiences. I wrote about it extensively in my book, and I don't want to take your time up because it's a lot of stuff. But this is my first experience with plant medicine. And it was so incredible that the next day, I went through a night of throwing up and all these experiences and, hallucinations, I guess they were, but they were extremely real. And took me back to other times with John, and it was life-changing. And when I woke up in the morning, I felt like someone had squeegeed my brain, and I was clear because I'd been through a very difficult time. My boyfriend of many years had disappeared on on a fishing trip. And so I had a lot of depression. I'd taken antidepressants for a while. But from that experience with ayahuasca, I stopped taking the antidepressants, and it's like something just helped erase all that negative, sad experience. Not, obviously not totally, but it took away all the sadness and helped my brain a lot.
And by the end of that first day, in between sessions of throwing up and having visions, by that night we were asking each other questions like, what would you like to do with the rest of your life? What's important for you? What's your key reason for being? And she was in the middle of creating a cancer wellness center in Melbourne, Australia, which is only $100 million short of being funded. And my objective was to see 100 million people on, having the advantage of eating Amazonian botanicals, right, and getting to another level of life experience. So we made a commitment then to each other to make these things happen, which is really all about healing. And the hospital is now up and rolling, and they got major funding. And we're well on the way to seeing tens of millions of people doing Amazonian botanicals. But maybe I'll answer your real question, which was, okay, so the core of our relationship was kind of built on a healing mode. I mean, that's what brought us together, and we came out of that space in Peru that first time. The next week I had her up in some special tambo mache up in the highlands. And 1 year later exactly, we went back and got married there in Peru.
And this week it's our 12th anniversary, this weekend, so.
Yeah.
Wow, happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So working with the plant medicine and these Amazonian botanicals and making formulations and things and selling exclusively to doctors for a while, then it opened up to the public. But one of the clinics I was working with in Georgia, over time, their main clientele just became cancer. So it kind of became known as a cancer clinic, although it wasn't. But most of their patients, that's just what's showing up in the population. And so we had the opportunity to see what was working, what wasn't working, and do some specific formulas. And through some extraordinary practitioners there, I learned a lot. I'm not a doctor, I'm a plant medicine guy. And so the material that we formulated that seemed to be getting the best results was really addressing a few things that are happening with cancer. One, you've got these cells that have gone rogue, right? And so they're out consuming a lot of energy and multiplying a lot faster than the other cells. So once they accumulate enough, they'll begin to form their own networks of vascularity, because they've got to go out and get a lot more energy, than they were getting before, to have these tumors really grow. And so that's called like an angiogenesis process. So there's several botanicals that have really strong anti-angiogenesis effects, things like a graviola, for example. And so you introduce the graviola, which is the leaf of a gigantic tree that grows in the Amazon. I've got 2,500 of these things growing down there, and we've got just tons of these leaves falling out. So it's not like so rare and exotic a thing. This thing's easily available. So this leaf has these acetogens in it. And so when you introduce it into the body, these acetogens have an affinity for fast-growing cells. And so that's where they migrate to. Leave everything else alone. They migrate to these really fast-growing cells and surround it and start compromising its ability to capture nutrients and to grow vascularity. So it really affects that tumor, right? It slows down that tumor growth. And when you do that, the tumor will initiate this kind of inflammatory response, or responding with inflammation. And so that should be waking up your immune system, which probably had gone to sleep for some reason and allowed these cells to grow. So that puts a focus there, wakes up the immune system. So you really need some strong immune-enhancing botanicals too, like Wendigato, like Camu Camu, and to really kickstart that immune response that would go there and break down those cells. And then, of course, you really need a lot of lymphatic drainage to get rid of these dying cells, because if they're not leaving your body in the detoxification channels, then that's going to slow down that whole cycle that fortunately you got started, right? You've identified a tumor, You've created an opportunity where you're breaking those tumor cells down, you get the immune system response on there, and things can start happening. So anyway, it was that kind of mindset and philosophy we're using at the clinic, and there were a whole variety of formulas and some IVs that we're doing at the clinic too, where we're seeing really good responses in a lot of people. So you're right. So when it comes down to, okay, now we've got something coming back with Olivia, yes, oh no, this is going on, so, we need to address it. And my mind just immediately went into addressing it in the ways that I know how to address it. All these botanical allies that we have that we can incorporate into our body to help initiate these healing responses. We were seeing it happening, and so I actually just rose up to a whole level of confidence and said, "Hey, no, this is part of life. This is a process, and let's just go address this."
And I had obviously total confidence in John. And then when he started growing medicinal cannabis and got terribly involved in the different genetics and breeding new ones for me specifically, and I've had such great relief from that, and very grateful to him and his tons of knowledge.
I love that characterization that you use, and I've never heard it before, botanical allies. And it really is a different lens that you look through, saying there are these things that exist in nature that can synergize with me and facilitate my healing. And it's kind of a different way of looking at the world as compared to the traditional medical approach, where you use these toxic substances to try to fight and kill something, as compared to saying there's something in nature that can help synergize with me and help me better express my health and well-being and healing. And what happens, I think, for many people, and Olivia, you must deal with this because of your hospital, it's kind of built around this philosophy, is that when they get a cancer diagnosis and you got people saying to them, "Oh, you got to do this. No, you need to do that. No, I heard you need to do this." There's all this sort of confusion and hysteria going on around them, and they're wondering what to do. But to come to a completely new framework, it's like being thrown into the deep end of a pool, saying, okay, dive in, and this is what you really should understand about cancer, and this is really the better, more rational approach towards it. How do you get people from that point A, which is the world and all the people whispering or screaming in their ear, and then kind of getting them into this, I think, very calm and very healthy mindset around their journey and how they want to proceed? How do you get them from that point A to that point B?
The Olivia Newton-John Centre, as it will now be called, is a comprehensive cancer centre that I allowed my name to be used to raise the funds to build it, because they were desperate for this building. It was really so depressing where the patients were being treated. But my caveat was that they build a wellness centre as part of this centre, because in Australia it's national health. So I cannot prescribe cannabis or any of these alternate healing things for the patients. I wish I could. My way of saying that I would only allow my name to be used if they had a wellness centre was hopefully to bring in some of these ideas and try and change the ideas of some of these old-fashioned ways of healing into some new thoughts. And I've done that, and it took a lot, because to have a wellness centre in a public hospital that had acupuncture and had oncological massage, those things took a lot to get approved to be in there. I mean, it's a special kind of acupuncture for people who have cancer, yoga, meditation, art, music, group therapies, all the things that I was able to provide for myself are now free in my particular hospital. And I hope that everyone does the same. A lot of people are now taking that idea because they realize how important the spirit is of the patient going through the treatment. Of course, I'd love to be able to prescribe all these things, but unfortunately I can't.
But the things that are there, like the oncological massage and the acupuncture and the music therapy, are so important. So, I'm really, really proud of her for insisting on these things happening there and then become a reality there. And it's not as comprehensive as either one of us would really like to see, but this is a really big institution and part of the issue that we're dealing with, Patrick, that you brought up. So I like to get people thinking about plant plant medicine, right? Botanical allies. And then I just take a step back to be totally inclusive and say, well, let's look at our relationship with the plant kingdom, okay? Everybody knows plants, okay? Let's just start with that. And we have a relationship with the plant kingdom and we're dependent on the plant kingdom for food, for shelter, for medicine. I mean, since we crawled out of a cave, and today still we're dependent on that plant kingdom for things, oxygen, for example. Plants take in carbon dioxide, give us oxygen. We take in oxygen, give back carbon dioxide. That's a really nice relationship we have with plants, and the fact that we're living off plants, eating plants, and building our houses out of plants, we've always had that relationship. And the plant medicine, and we can use cannabis because it's a perfect poster child for the entire botanical kingdom in representing how valuable it is in food, fiber, and medicine. We know you can eat the seeds, the hemp seeds. They're a very rich source of omegas. And the fiber, the fibrous stalk. I mean, hemp, they're even mixing it with some polymers and making car bumpers out of it that are stronger than steel. And we make clothes out of it and fabric. I mean, it's an extraordinary example of that. And then the medicinal part, in the flowers, we're just recognizing how valuable that is. And so that as a plant, and of course, because it's cannabis, it's got also this really nice colorful history. When I look at it, it's another member of the plant kingdom growing wild out of the ground, and yet this one's been segregated and put labels on it, abused, it's outlawed, and so it's pretty colorful. And then when you really look at it, it's really one of the key allies coming from the plant kingdom. So yeah, the last 7 years I've really gotten engaged. I've got a little cannabis research grow here. I've bred some new genetics and got 23 different chemovars growing right now, and had the opportunity to get to Israel and meet Raphael Mechoulam, who first discovered tetrahydrocannabinol in the 1960s as one of the first. He discovered the first cannabinoid, and then later he identified an entourage effect, which is the effect of all the terpenes and naturally occurring other and minor cannabinoids in cannabis. So I've been very fortunate to meet some key people. Dedi Miri in Israel at Tech9 Institute, he's identified now 140 cannabinoids, and one of the premier researchers in the world in this. So with my experience with botanicals in the curanderas in the rainforest and understanding plants really from an energetic standpoint as well, cannabis is really giving us a huge opportunity to take our health to another place. Of course, it was in 1937, it was made illegal. In 1980, you had a drug made from cannabis for cancer pain called Marinol, a pharmaceutical drug. If you haven't heard of it, it's probably because that using cannabis in its natural form tends to be more effective from the practitioners I'm talking to than that drug, so it's very seldom even used. And so our relationship has grown. But 100 years ago today, say this was in the 1920s, you could go to the pharmacy, the drugstore, and over the counter there were cannabis extracts available. And so they became illegal. And then, of course, later on, after Raphael had looked at THC, and he spent his whole life studying cannabis, his entire career, and we're seeing other things happen in that world. We're seeing that cannabis is now used for MS, it's used for epilepsy, it's used for seizures, it's used for anxiety, it's used for depression, it's used for Parkinson's, it's used for cancer, and there's a reason why. It has all these specific compounds in it, even though federally it's still a Schedule I drug. This says it has no medicinal value. At the same time, the United States government actually has a patent on cannabis for its ability as a neuroprotective agent with Alzheimer's. So that's a little curious footnote. But You know, the medicinal value of this, when it comes to cancer, there's specific cannabinoids that seem to be interrupting the migration of cancer cells. There's other cannabinoids that seem to be actually creating an apoptosis, where actually programming cancer cells to die a normal death like they would. They just forget to die. They keep on growing and replicating. So it reverses that and helps them to die. And then the terpenes have really strong value too, which is the essential oils, the smell of cannabis. Some smells kind of skunky, some smell like lavender, some like citrus, some like diesel fuel. And that's the specific terpene or terpenoid compounds inside the cannabis. And each of those also has therapeutic value. So a specific strain of cannabis will come with a whole profile and complement of terpenes and cannabinoids. And the terpenes have been shown to help the cannabinoids fully express. So we're talking about, you know, actually full spectrum cannabis and various kinds of cannabis that I grow that I end up combining, because some have the terpenes I want, some have the cannabinoids I want, and it's not just CBD and THC, it's CBG, it's CBC, CBN, CBDV, THCV, and then all the acidic compounds of those things too, the non-decarboxylated form of those compounds. So it's a very, very exciting place, and we're seeing some exciting things happen. It's getting the attention of really researchers really around the world right now, and I'm just very happy with where all that's going.
It's helped me greatly, and I was able to, when I was in the hospital with my fractured sacrum, I was on heavy doses of morphine and didn't like it at all. It killed my appetite. I didn't feel well. I was determined from the first day I started taking it that I would wean myself off. Somehow, I didn't know how, but with John's cannabis that he grew for me, I was able to wean myself off morphine. And if I can do that, it's so much safer. You don't die from cannabis, but so many people die from opiates that I think there should be made a public awareness about the fact that you can wean yourself off morphine and by using cannabis. I mean, what a great way to go.
It was a great thing to see happen, Patrick, when you're talking about doing something and seeing an immediate result. We've seen results with full profile of markers that you would do, but the pain, people know when they're in pain and they're not in pain. And coming back with all these prescriptions of morphine, and you had morphine drips going on in the hospital and all that. So this we got to deal with. So there's several formulas that I had made, and it just kind of going through them, and we hit one, and the pain just dropped, pretty much immediately. And every day the mobility started rapidly increasing. So the specific compounds in cannabis is not all the same. This is going to be, we're going to really be into this research for the next dozen years or so. It's very exciting what's happening.
Wow.
I'm grateful at the astonishing health that Olivia's in at this point in time. No one would have expected that, and we're just super grateful. I mean, we know we're blessed, and maybe everyone doesn't have the same opportunity, but we want to make sure everyone does have that same opportunity. And we're working in Australia with the cannabis thing to make that available. And I talk about the Amazonian botanicals, specific botanicals and their history and their literature, and how in combination they can work. And so we're excited to see all of this, and the audience for this really grow as well, because there's a much huger audience for that now. People want something that's going to work.
In summary, what really occurs to me here is the thought experiment. Try to imagine, what if, Olivia, you were never exposed to any of this? What if you didn't understand cannabis? What if you didn't understand, the botanical allies that John talks about? What if this wasn't a part of anything that was introduced to you as even something that was an option or a path that you can walk, or something that can be an adjunct to what you were doing, and you were just thrown into the conventional medical system as is without any of these considerations? I mean, I really shudder to think about where you might be right now, or what your circumstance could be right now if you didn't have access to all of this. And it's really a part of the purpose of this whole production is to bring these things to light. So it's really, in some respects, a chilling thought.
Yeah, I know. I have thought of that, and I think of it because I speak to a number of women who are going through metastatic breast cancer who haven't had the opportunity to use the products that are available to me, and I see what a difficult time they're having. Mm-hmm. And I offer advice, but I don't tell anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with. Everyone has to make their own decision on their journey. But I know I may not be here if it hadn't been for these things. And also to be exposed to Louise Hay and to my husband's incredible positivity and staying around positive people, because all that is, I was luckily born that way, but you need to be reinforced because, as I say, the mindset is so important. But I really believe that all the things that I've gone through are with purpose. I wouldn't have been involved in my ONJ Center had it not been for this experience. I wouldn't have thought about putting my name to a cancer center, a cancer wellness center, had I not been through it myself and want to help other people. I would love to change the way we treat people to kinder therapies. That's my goal. So to treat people kindly and help the body heal itself,
Well, John and Olivia, I want to first say I really appreciate you taking the time to sit and have this conversation. But not only that, I want to tell you how much I appreciate how openly you shared all these experiences. I think that there's a lot of people who are very confused out there right now, and you maybe helped clear up a lot of this confusion. But maybe most importantly is the amount of hope that you've given people through your own story, through your own education, what you've learned along the way, and the outcomes that you've created for yourself in this life. It's really going to make a big difference in people's lives. So thank you so very much for doing all of that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for the great work you're doing.
Thank you so much. That completes episode 1. We have now taken the first step on this journey. Before we end it here and head into episode 2, I want to encourage you to share The Answer to Cancer. We are in a free viewing period right now. Anybody in the world can watch this for free. So please share this information, spread it far and wide, support us in this mission, and let's spend this time together and make it count. So again, this completes episode 1. I will look forward to being with you in episode 2.
Why are we getting cancer in the first place? Why isn't anyone asking why? We have to start wrapping our minds around the fact that we are creating our own dis-ease. What are you putting in your mouth? All the food. What's all your personal care items? What are you putting on your skin every single day? Becoming your own thermostat, mind, body, and spirit, has to be in balance every day. And that will very slowly reverse the erosion of your health.
People are so indoctrinated to just trust the hospitals, trust doctors, that when they saw us doing what they saw to be the complete opposite, there wasn't a lot of understanding.
Our immediate family was very supportive, but as far as our, circle of friends and acquaintances and whatever, a lot of people made themselves pretty scarce pretty quickly. After that first round, it was made very clear that if we don't continue playing ball, that there would be an intervention and he would be taken away.